an important piece of information from around the Asian continent. But today I decided to sort of take a deep dive on the US presidential elections, the upcoming elections on November 3rd. Um, I think it's a very hot topic, and I wanted to just, get that information in because what happens in the United States matters to the rest of the world. And I have a very exciting guest today. I'm very excited to welcome Kristen Myers. She is a senior writer and an on-air host with Yahoo Finance. She covers politics, policy, and money. She's also a dear friend of mine, and we've also a former colleague. We worked together at Al Jazeera America back in the day in New York. Welcome, Kristen, to the Asia Roundup with me.
Hi, I'm so glad we're doing this.
Yeah, and Kristen, I've seen your coverage on Yahoo Finance for the longest time, and you've been digging up some great information as far as like fundraising and all of the campaign trails and stuff is concerned. I just wanted to sort of dive right into that. So, there was a report that you did a few weeks ago about how Biden has been able to raise around $383 million through fundraising in the month of September. I'm reading that now fundraising is any projection as to what we can expect in the presidential election in November this year?
So you cut out just a little bit, but I think I heard the tail end of the question, which is that a good number to raise in just 1 month? And the answer is it's a phenomenal number to raise in just 1 month. It's actually record breaking. So far, this is set to be the most expensive elections that the United States has ever seen, as long as we've been, recording these fundraising numbers. And the fact that Joe Biden was able to raise $383 million in 1 month in the midst of a pandemic, when millions of Americans are currently unemployed, and the average donation that his campaign announced was around $44. That is a huge amount of money. And what's really important about that fundraising number, Richa, you have to remember, is that for months, Democrats had lagged far behind the Republicans and the Trump campaign when it came to fundraising. Donald Trump has been amazing at motivating those small dollar donors, which is something that Republicans typically can't do. They typically rely on those really wealthy, businessmen that are giving $10 million, $20 million at a clip. Donald Trump was able to change that for the Republican Party. And so far that we've seen for the 2020 election, he has been able to raise a ton of money. Until recently. Now he is lagging far behind former Vice President Joe Biden when it comes to fundraising, and not just in those monthly numbers, Richard. He's also lagging far behind in that cash on hand figure. And that's a really important number that we like to talk about, because cash on hand numbers are the money that any campaign uses to pay staff, for example, pay for advertisements on Facebook, on television, on Twitter, wherever they are choosing to advertise. So that cash on hand number is really important. That's essentially the amount of money they have in the bank. And right now we are seeing Joe Biden really take a huge lead over Donald Trump in that area. And the reason this fundraising figure is so important is that typically when it comes to American politics, the person with the biggest purse is typically the person that wins. That is not always true. I do want to highlight that. Donald Trump spent far less than Hillary Clinton did, for example, and we all know how that election turned out 4 years ago. But it is hugely important to see that Joe Biden has been able to motivate and mobilize so many financial supporters, again, in the midst of a pandemic, which has been particularly painful economically here in the United States.
Kristen, you talked about the pandemic, and, I wanted to talk about how, November 3rd is going to be a watershed moment for the United States as far as the elections are concerned. America has been reeling under the Black Lives Matter movement, the pandemic, of course. So this election becomes extremely important. I want to talk about voting now next. And we saw these great images in New York yesterday. People went out and did early voting. It was just like so overwhelming to see the number of lines and also the wait time. People waited for over 6 hours even. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, what this means? Because while there is a lot of enthusiasm, why are our voters having to wait for those many hours to cast their ballot?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So early voting day, for those who might not know, was just yesterday. I personally voted by mail. I'm not unusual in that so many Americans are choosing now to vote by mail, particularly because of the pandemic. They don't want to have to go and wait in a line with a bunch of other people and possibly get this deadly virus. However, we are seeing, and I personally saw, I was out yesterday and I saw lines around the block in the city. One of my colleagues, she posted a video of a line that was about a quarter of a mile long. And I can't mentally translate that now into kilometers for everyone that is on the metric system watching, but that is a huge length of time. My mother voted yesterday in a long line here where I live in New York to go vote. And so what we're seeing is that there are a lot of people that are choosing to vote early, which typically doesn't happen. So I actually have a couple numbers for you. I decided to look some up. So 18 to 29 is a key voting block. This is a voting block that typically doesn't vote compared to older voters. And we are seeing those early voting numbers double and in some cases triple. So I'll give you some key swing states here. In Michigan, 145,201 early voters, and that's versus 7,500 in 2016. So that is a huge uptick there. In Florida, over 250,000 early voters, and that's compared to roughly 45,000 back in 2016. And over in North Carolina, over 200,000 early voters. That's compared to just 25,000 in 2016. So we are seeing a lot of people incredibly motivated in 2020 to get out and vote. Now, you ask why that's happening. I think this is kind of a twofold answer. On the one hand, right, you have the 2020 election just incredibly divisive. And it has made a lot of people become very motivated. This is why Donald Trump is such an important political candidate. Whether you like him or you don't like him, leaving his policies to the side, he has been a very unusual political figure. And he's been a political figure in United States history that has been able to, frankly, motivate voters in a way that we have not seen in quite some time. So that's one of the reasons you're seeing those really long early voting lines. Frankly, just more people are interested in getting out and voting. We are seeing states report increases in the numbers of registered voters. Now, of course, registered voters does not mean an actual voter. You have to get to the polls after you register. But it is an encouraging sign that we are seeing all across the United States more and more voters deciding, hey, in 2020, I am going to get out and I'm going to vote. The second reason that you are asking that question, why are there such long voting lines? Well, frankly, in the United States, there has been a huge problem of voter suppression, particularly in Black and brown communities. And what we have seen throughout the years is that polling places have started to shrink. Those numbers of polling places have started to be reduced. And so we are seeing in some communities, this is not true for every community, of course, that has a long line, but in some communities facing really long polling lines, it is simply because there's not enough polling places to support the population there that wants to get out and vote. So if you have one polling location, for example, for over 30,000 people, that's just a number I'm calling, you're going to be facing a very long line in order to vote. And so this is something that has been happening routinely across the United States. And a lot of Democrats particularly, but a lot of voting rights activists have said, listen, this is a problem that we are experiencing across the United States of voter suppression.
You mentioned Black and brown communities and, how there is voter suppression. I wanted to get into, especially for our viewers who are used to the Asia Roundup, just to get them into the whole political voting system in the United States, I want to delve into the Electoral College. And I know that that's what ultimately decides the elections in the United States, as we've seen in 2016. So can you talk to us about what Electoral College is, why it was sort of put in place, and what is its significance in the 2020 elections this year?
So this is a really good question because I don't think a lot of people outside the United States know that we actually don't vote the popular vote, for example. The popular vote is not technically what decides the election. Essentially, each state has a number of electoral college votes, which actually equals the amount of representatives they have in the House of Representatives, but also the U.S. Senate. So essentially, that's going to decide how many electoral college votes that you have. And each candidate has to reach a threshold of the electoral college in order to become the president of the United States. So typically what happens is, I'll use New York, for example. I believe we have around 29 electoral college votes. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it's over 20. Essentially, in New York, everyone goes to vote, and the electoral college within the state will cast their vote in line with the vote of the popular vote within the state. So right now, Donald Trump is not winning New York State. Joe Biden typically leads the state. This is a more Democratic. We have urban centers that are far more Democratic than are Republican. And so in the 2020 election, what we are expecting to see is that Joe Biden will win New York State, which means that he will win the electoral college votes for the state. But in a state like Texas, for example, which is more of a non-voting state or a purple state, which means that typically it leans Republican, Donald Trump, for example, might win that state, and he will take all the electoral college votes within that state. What that means is that if you win the popular vote, you do not necessarily win the electoral college votes. Because the way that the electoral college system was created was essentially made so that smaller states would not be left out of the political process, that they still would have a voice. They would not be overrun, for example, by some of these larger states. And we also see that what our founding fathers did not want was more rural areas to be overrun by those more urban centers, places like Los Angeles or New York City, for example. So the electoral college was created to essentially prevent these bigger states from bullying these smaller states in a way for the presidency, but also importantly enough to also prevent an uninformed voter from electing the president of the United States.
And do you think that this system of the Electoral College is actually still relevant in 2020, especially with Black Lives Matter and racial justice movements going on in the country?
So the reason that the Electoral College is particularly important, and it continues to be brought up repeatedly, especially over the last few years, is that a lot of folks are saying, hey, the Electoral College is an antiquated system created hundreds of years ago, and perhaps we need to rethink our voting system. No voting system is perfect. The Electoral College is no exception. And perhaps we need to come up with better solutions for today. And another reason that folks don't necessarily like the Electoral College is that they say it's not really fair for the winner of the popular vote, and this happened in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but she lost in the Electoral College. And so a lot of folks are saying, listen, frankly, it should be that the majority of the population of the United States should pick who the president of the United States is going to be. It shouldn't be this system where, if you get more states with those electoral college votes, but you lose on the popular vote, you can still win the presidency. And so those are some of the pros and cons that we are seeing. It would require an amendment change in the Constitution. So that's another uphill battle that is a part of this. But yeah, a lot of folks are saying, listen, it's 2020, it's 2024, it's 2028. We need to come up with a different system of voting.
Kristen, I want to get into the swing states as well. Both the presidential candidates, Trump and Biden, are, carrying out rallies in swing states this weekend. What are the projections looking like as far as those swing states are concerned? If you can maybe, sort of throw light on some of the states.
Yeah, so the swing states are these battleground states right now where essentially it could be a toss-up, right? And these battleground states are typically what decides the election. As I mentioned earlier, it's pretty much well known that a state like California, for example, is going to go for Joe Biden, or a state like New York is going to go for Joe Biden. But in a state like Michigan, who knows, right? So when every campaign is calculating out how many electoral college votes they can already count on going into the election, they already know that certain states are in their pocket. right? But we have these swing states, and these are the states that essentially are going to, what we like to say, decide the election, because it could go either way. So Michigan, for example, is one of the more popular swing states right now, according to the latest polls. And this is just using 538. I tend to use 538 quite a bit because they like to collate all of the polling that's done around the country. Right now in a state like Michigan, for example, Joe Biden is up around 9 or 10 points. In Florida, another big swing state, that was particularly important a couple of years back in the election between George Bush and Al Gore. In Florida right now, we see in some of the more, what 538 classifies as reputable polls, Biden is up by roughly 4 or 5 points. I do want to mention, however, that Florida seems to be a bit of a more toss-up state. There are several polls that show that Trump is leading in the polls. In Pennsylvania, Biden is also up in that state by roughly 7 points right now. Here's the thing about polling, however. It gets wrong. It gets it wrong. It got it wrong in 2016. If we followed the polls in the election 4 years ago, well, then Hillary Clinton would have become the president, and she clearly did it. And what we are finding is that one, voters, frankly, are not as honest on the polls as we would like to think that they are. And two, some of these polls, you have to look at whether they are actually tabulating registered voters or just people that live within that state. There is a big difference between the two. And thirdly, frankly, sometimes, like I mentioned, these polls just absolutely get it wrong. And so while these polls are a nice indicator of, a temperature check, if you will, of how people are feeling, they're not at all the rule of law. You cannot 100% rely on these polls. So you can't look at a poll that says, hey, right now, Joe Biden is winning Pennsylvania, because then you might be in for a real surprise on election night if Donald Trump takes that state.
And I think that's what happened in 2016 as well. A lot of these Trump supporters, were undercounted in these polls because the polls kept projecting that Hillary Clinton would win. And, rightly, she did win the popular vote. But, I wonder if that is something that the polling authorities are looking into and trying to sort of maybe fix or what have you. Just because we are known as the Asia round, I want to China. Kristen, by matter of who gets the White House in this year's elections, China will be a major point of contention as far as US-China policies are concerned, whether it's economic policies, human rights. We've seen so many things happen in Hong Kong and in China as far as human rights and press freedom is concerned. Can you talk to us about what that looks like if Trump or Biden, either one of them, comes into power?
So when it comes to Joe Biden, so I'll talk about him next. It's a little bit unclear what the relationship with China is going to look like going forward. But when it comes to President Trump, we already have a sense of what that's going to look like. Because President Trump, frankly, over the last couple of years, by initiating this U.S.-China trade deal, if you can call it that, has taken a far more confrontational, more unilateral approach. As a result, right now, we have seen that tensions between the United States and China have only started to rise, and the relationship between the U.S. and China has only continued to worsen. A few things on this, again, no matter your politics, the thing is that China has created a lot of policies that economically are not necessarily beneficial to the United States. The problem, however, with creating a trade deal is that right now it has created a lot of chaos and a lot of unpredictability for businesses that need to do business with China, right? We have these sanctions, we have these tariffs, or not sanctions, but these tariffs that are going into place, that have continued to go into place against China. And a lot of companies, frankly, do not know how they're supposed to be doing business going forward with a trade deal that is essentially at a stalemate. If we had a trade deal that went through, for example, we probably would all be singing an incredibly different tune. When it comes to Biden, however, and Trump is correct when he says that a lot of presidents have not really tried to go after China economically or financially in terms of negotiating a new trade deal. We're a little bit unclear on how Biden might handle this. Biden has said that he is not going to be taking the same sort of aggressive stance that any deal, if he, becomes the president, that he's going to move forward and negotiate at the table and get some sort of deal done. But we actually do not know exactly what a Biden presidency would look like in terms of U.S.-China trade relations or even tensions. However, I think that we can expect something a little bit more on the lines of what we've seen in the past Democratic presidencies, particularly the Barack Obama and Joe Biden White House, which is, again, a far less aggressive stance against China, because whether you like them or not, they are an important economic and trading partner. And so it is important for us to come to some sort of agreement with that nation.
Also, we've talked about voter suppression, and you sort of gave us a great overview on that. I want to get into the Supreme Court rulings also, because a lot of rulings were passed. For example, in Alabama, curbside voting was blocked recently, which was, an option available during the pandemic, especially for at-risk voters and, voters with disabilities. What has Supreme Court's role been overall as far as like voting, mail-in ballot, or just voting rights are concerned, specifically given that we're in the middle of a pandemic?
Right. So primarily right now, the Supreme Court, we have something called the Voting Rights Act, which essentially allowed equitable access to voting. And a lot of legal scholars and also voting rights activists have said that, frankly, throughout the years, the Voting Rights Act has been slowly stripped away. Right now, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court has handled some of these smaller cases, but we haven't seen the Supreme Court, and we won't be seeing the Supreme Court weigh in before the election on voting rights writ large, right? So I don't imagine that we'll be seeing some sort of constitutional amendment or new law in terms of voting before the election. However, I want to be very clear on this. The Supreme Court will be very important in this election, not necessarily because of voting rights, but for the election results itself. So we have seen, and actually analysts, financial and economic analysts, and I've talked about this a lot on my show, have pretty much said that a contested election was going to be the base case, right? That has seemed to faded a little bit over the last couple of weeks. But a contested election is still very much possible. If Donald Trump loses on election night, there are many that believe that he will challenge the results of the election, saying that either folks did not get the opportunity to vote, or that some of the ballots that were cast should be thrown out or are not actually eligible to be counted as a ballot. And so we might hear the Supreme Court. This is when the Supreme Court will actually have to weigh in on the results of the election. We did, of course, see that happen back in George Bush versus Al Gore. We all know the outcome of that. We saw that George Bush become the president. But that is where I believe the Supreme Court really might be incredibly important in the 2020 election specifically. If there is a contested election, it will be going over to the Supreme Court to decide. And if we have Amy Coney Barrett, whose nomination is working its way right now through the Senate, they did vote, they did pass that procedural motion to essentially vote on her nomination. This is why people are so concerned about Donald Trump being able to push and jam through his nominee right before the election. Many people worry that if the Supreme Court is in charge of the election results this year, that having another Republican judge on the court is going to essentially pack the court in his favor.
So very important elections, on November 3rd. So I hope that Americans will go out in overwhelming numbers and cast their vote on November 3rd. Christian, before you go, I just like to always ask my guests about, the pandemic situation in their regions or countries. You're in New York. Can you tell us what's the status like in New York or even in the United States?
So the United States as a whole, as we all know, because of every different state, is incredibly different across the board, right? So every governor has been taking a very different approach to the pandemic. Here in New York, we have seen Governor Cuomo take a very strict and stringent approach against the virus. He shut everything down. Some say a little bit too late. However, many, because of that, and because of those, really stringent restrictions, we did see the case counts plummet here in New York, which actually had one of the highest number of cases. However, things have started to reopen. We have seen restaurants start to reopen. People are still going out, but everyone does, at least here in New York, typically tend to wear a mask. However, I do want to say that that's not a positive picture that I think we can get too, comfortable with. We are starting to see case counts around the United States as a whole, even here in New York, start to surge. Just the other day, we actually had the highest single number of daily case counts in quite some time. So we are starting to see that trend, that really positive trend of those case counts starting to fall. We're starting to see that reverse. A lot of folks are saying, hey, this is the second wave that we were talking about. Others are saying, well, this is just a function of the fact that people are getting a little bit more lax, schools are reopening. But either way, it is a really worrying trend that we are starting to see lately, where those case counts are starting to be on the rise again.
Well, I hope that we can, come out of this pandemic strong soon, especially given that we are in the worst hit countries, the US and India. But thank you so much for joining me, Kristen. It was great. I'm sure our viewers will benefit from this conversation, especially those who are not super well aware about how American voting system and presidential elections work. So thank you again for joining me.
Of course. Lovely talking with you.